Sometimes, the same story gets adapted over and over again from one medium to another and another. And I love that. You get to look at all the little changes they made and how they impact on the story and make each version unique. A great example is Mobile Suit Gundam, the anime classic that started a franchise. So today we're going to look at 9 different versions of that. The original TV series, the movie trilogy, the novel trilogy, 3 completely separate manga adaptations, one of which is pretty obscure and kind of weird, and 3 of the many Gundam video games. Actually, we're going to zoom in a little more. Today's video is a deep dive into just the first third of the series. That way we have time to get into all of the fascinating fiddly details. What changes did they make? What are the pros and cons of each version? And above all, which ones are actually worth going back to after all these years? Before we begin, a quick spoiler warning. This video will cover up to episode 14 of Mobile Suit Gundam, and the equivalent portion of all those adaptations. I will go into a lot of detail, so fair warning. But I won't talk much about the rest of the series, so if you decide to watch it after this, don't worry, there'll be plenty left to discover. To start off, let's take a look at the original series itself, which ran for 43 episodes starting in 1979. It tells the story of the 1-year war, an interstellar conflict between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon. It explores themes of how war affects civilians and soldiers, and civilians forced to become soldiers, the lives lost and the mental toll on the survivors. Also, it's a fun action show made to sell toy robots. Now, since this video is about how all the other versions compare to the original, in a way, the whole video is about the TV series, so I'll fill in a lot of the details later. By the end, you will definitely get a clear picture of the show's strengths and weaknesses. For now, let's treat this as the introductory section. If you're new to the series, there's a lot you'll need to know for the rest of the video to make sense, so let's try to speed through the basics. If you're familiar with the story already, feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter. Gundam is set in a future where mankind has mostly moved to space colonies, but the Earth Federation is still in charge, which inevitably sparked a revolution, with some colonies declaring independence. Sadly, that independence movement has ended up as a dictatorship called the Principality of Zeon. The year is Universal Century 0079. Not long ago, Zeon started a war with the Earth Federation. It's now in a stalemate, but immense amounts of people have died and the situation's pretty tense. You see, Zeon got the upper hand by developing a powerful new type of weapon called a mobile suit. But the Federation is getting ready to fight back. They're secretly developing mobile suits of their own. That's where our story begins, on Side 7, the colony where the Federation is building that new tech. There we meet our main character, Amuro Ray, a teenage boy who loves tinkering with technology, getting so engrossed in it that he sits around in his underpants, totally oblivious to the world around him. He lives with his dad, but his dad is sort of an absentee parent who's busy working on the mobile suit project. Right now, in fact, his dad is returning from a trip to Earth on a ship that's supposed to be picking up the fancy new technology. When that ship, the White Base, arrives at Side 7, it all kicks off. Zeon soldiers sneak into the colony, spot the new mobile suits, and start raining down death and destruction. Amid all the chaos, Amuro comes across the most powerful of the new Federation mobile suits, the Gundam, along with its instruction manual. He decides to climb inside the Gundam, and he successfully uses it to fight off the Zeon soldiers. In the process, however, he makes a hole in the colony and unknowingly sends his own father hurtling out into space. For reference, most of what we've had so far are major events that occur in every version we're looking at today. The main backstory doesn't really change, and Amuro getting into the Gundam is the key moment that sets him on his path for the rest of the series. While we already have some stuff that varies, there are several adaptations where Amuro never sends his dad flying into space, one where Amuro doesn't live on Side 7 at the start of the story, and one where Amuro doesn't exist at all. Look forward to that. Anyway, the assault on Side 7 continues. There's a Zeon ship right outside, putting both the colony and the White Base in danger. In the end, a whole load of civilians escape onto the White Base, including Amuro. The White Base's goal now is to quickly pick up whatever they can of the new mobile suit tech, destroy the rest so Zeon can't get their hands on it, and then get as far away as possible. The big problem with that plan: they don't really have a crew anymore. Most of them got killed during Zeon's attack on the colony, and the captain, a man called Paulo Cassius, is heavily injured in a sort of intermittently lucid state. That's how the White Base ends up fighting its way through Zeon forces, while crewed by a ragtag band of junior officers and civilians. The man in charge is Bright Noah, who ends up as the highest ranking officer on board despite his lack of experience. In his introductory scene, we are told he's 19 years old. I will note, some version of that scene appears in most of the adaptations we're looking at today, but in every other version, they leave out the mention of Bright's age. Understandable, since he really doesn't come across as a 19-year-old. The White Base does have a secret weapon, the Gundam, but their only pilot is Amuro, a teenager with no combat experience at all. Bright and Amuro immediately bristle against each other. Bright is less than happy when he realises the Gundam is being piloted by some random kid. Then, after Amuro's first space battle, Bright has no encouragement for him, just some gruff tips for improvement and comments like, "Grow up, you're a pilot now," and "I don't mind if you hate me." Right from the start, it's looking like a great working relationship. Let's quickly run through the rest of the character roster. In our main cast, the only other soldier is Ryu Jose, a trainee pilot. He's sort of a gentle giant character who everyone likes, and they rely on him a lot in combat. Among the civilians, we have quite a few key figures. Some are friends of Amuro's from Side 7, such as Frau Bo, who's always making sure he eats and doesn't wear the same clothes for days on end. Sadly, Amuro doesn't pay enough attention to notice her feelings for him. She also takes care of these 3 orphans. Note, the orphans appear a lot, but they rarely do anything important. They're often seen hanging out with Haro, Amuro's pet robot. Also helping out is Amuro's next-door neighbour, Hayato Kobayashi. Then there's Kai Shiden, a wisecracking scaredy cat who joins the fight a bit reluctantly. He's often seen hanging around the bridge getting on everyone's nerves. Mirai Yashima is a civilian pilot who becomes the White Base's pilot because she's the best option they have. Finally, there's Sailor Mass, a no-nonsense medical student who becomes the ship's main communications officer. When Amuro isn't convinced he's capable of doing what's asked of him, she's often the one giving him a firmly worded pep talk. Sailor is also notable for her connection to Shah Aznavour, a masked figure who serves as one of the main villains. He's also known as the Red Comet. You see, the Zeon forces use these mobile suits called Zakus, which are green, but Shah's Zaku is red and is 3 times the speed of a normal Zaku, hence Red Comet. Shah often finds himself dueling with the Gundam. He and Amuro quickly become rivals. But he also has secrets and his own agenda. In episode 2, he and Sailor meet by chance and recognise each other as long-lost brother and sister. How did they end up on different sides of this war? So, that sets up the basic premise and pretty much gives you the key details of episodes 1 and 2. With that in mind, let's quickly skim through the remaining 12 episodes we're covering today, so you have an idea of the general direction of the plot. The crew decides to attack Shah while he's resupplying, and Amuro shows off his tactical know-how but gets a dressing down from Bright anyway. They reach the nearest Federation base, but instead of a warm welcome, they're met with imprisonment for their handling of top-secret technology. Captain Paolo ends up pulling rank, but that's his last hurrah. They hold a funeral for him on the White Base. The White Base returns to Earth, putting Amuro at risk of burning up on entry when he stays outside in the Gundam too long. Shah's attack puts the ship off course, and they land in Zeon territory. Shah teams up with the Zeon commander in charge of the area, Garma Zabi, his old buddy from his academy days. Then Amuro goes kind of berserk after being made to fight again on too little rest. While Amuro attempts a plan to fly past the enemy to reach the Federation, some of the refugees on board stage a hostage situation because they really want the White Base to drop them off in enemy territory. The refugees get the spotlight again as the crew plans to drop them off after all. They ask Zeon for a temporary ceasefire while secretly using it to sneak the Gundam behind enemy lines. Amuro refuses to fight, so Bright slaps him in the face. Later, a Federation officer, Matilda, visits and tells Amuro he might have psychic powers. As the White Base hides in a ruined city, Garma goes to a swanky ball where he professes true love to his girlfriend. Then he goes out into battle, whereupon he dies because Shah betrays him. Garma's family, the rulers of Zeon, gather to discuss his funeral arrangements. Meanwhile, Garma's girlfriend swears revenge, but ultimately doesn't achieve much except leaving Amuro with some new trauma. Amuro is barely functional at this point, but Bright forces him to go out anyway, and he gets attacked by a new villain in a new mobile suit he can't hope to defeat. Meanwhile, an enormous state funeral is held for Garma, and his oldest brother gives a rousing propaganda speech. The crew stops off for a vacation, and Amuro is reunited with his mother, who isn't happy that he's become capable of violence. And finally, some bored Zeon soldiers put bombs all over the Gundam. Will Amuro be able to remove them in time? Yes, he will. So, that's a very abridged summary of this group of episodes, but it'll do for now. As noted earlier, we'll discuss them all in more detail later. For now, let's move on to the very first adaptation, and also the least famous, the manga by Yu Okazaki that ran alongside the original TV broadcast. The first chapter was published in 1979 in the May issue of Boken o Komiku Bunko, or Adventure King Comics, shortly after the TV series started airing that April. This puts it in a unique spot compared to the versions we'll look at later in two ways. One, it had to keep up an impossible pace. It belongs to a long line of anime tie-in manga that are released monthly while being based on a weekly anime. They either had to drastically cut down the story or fall way behind the anime, or both. Spoilers, it was both. Two, it didn't have the benefit of hindsight. Any decisions about how to shorten the story were made with no concept of what would turn out to really matter, both for the story itself and in a broader sense. The author couldn't have known what we, the fans, would think of as essential iconic moments decades down the line. That makes it fascinating to read now. It's like the Wild West of Gundam, a look into a world where the story can be reworked without any grand reverence for the source material. As of this recording, this manga hasn't ever been officially released in English, and I don't believe there's ever been a fan translation either. Thankfully, that's not an obstacle for me, and since there's so little information about it online, I'll try to go into a bit of detail for you. We start with a relatively straight adaptation of episode 1. There are definitely some differences. For example, there's a little more focus on the Side 7 civilians. This little exchange about why space colony inhabitants might seek independence is so on brand for Gundam that I sort of wonder if it came from an early version of the TV script. Later, Amuro doesn't leave the shelter on his own as in the anime. Instead, the people revolt en masse demanding safe harbour on the White Base, only to walk outside and start getting gunned down by a Zaku, which is depicted quite grotesquely. In this version, Amuro doesn't blow a hole in the colony, launching his dad out into space, but his dad probably does even worse here because Char completely blows up Side 7. This is where the story starts getting more condensed. We get an abbreviated version of episode 2 with Amuro fighting Char as the White Base escapes, and then Bright says they're headed straight to Earth. They don't stop off at the Luna 2 base at all in this version, which means we don't meet Wakane, the stuffy commander who puts them all in jail. Around this point, Amuro comes back aboard and Bright punches him, a sort of proto-Bright slap that happens way earlier in the story. But in this case, it's not because Amuro is sick of fighting, but because he took the Gundam out without permission. In general, this version depicts Amuro more as a hot-blooded hero than a struggling teenager. Anyway, as in episode 5, there's some combat as the White Base and the Gundam enter Earth's atmosphere. However, all the anime's tension about which craft are capable of atmospheric entry and which aren't, and whether Amuro will get to safety in time, that's all totally missing. But it ends with more or less the same plot points as episode 5. Char's attack changed the White Base's angle of descent, so now they're stuck in enemy territory, while Char contacts Gamma, who's in charge there. The next chapter gives us a rough adaptation of episodes 6 and 7, with Gamma sending out fighters, Zakus, tanks, and finally, Char. After that, we get a version of episode 10. For those keeping track, that means we skipped all the Bright and Amuro drama and Matilda's appearance, and are getting straight to the part where Char betrays Gamma, deliberately getting him killed. In fact, we're even skipping parts of that because we don't see any hint of the fancy party where Gamma leaves his beloved to go and fight. As a small note, the anime leaves it a little vague which city the White Base is hiding out in here, but this manga specifically shows us the Statue of Liberty and the Chrysler Building. We of course skip most of episode 11, which is about Gamma's lover. However, we do get a version of the Zabi family reunion scene. Gamma's family is introduced here, his father, who is the sovereign of the Principality of Zeon, and Gamma's 3 siblings. I won't go into full detail here, but the ringleader is Giran, the oldest sibling, who proposes using Gamma's death to rally the people. The manga preserves all this pretty well, which actually applies to almost every version. The Gamma funeral stuff really tends to stay intact. 3 pages are spent on Giran's speech, in fact, which feels like a lot in a manga that's been all action all the time. Speaking of action, Amuro's response to the speech was fairly muted in the anime, but here he's so angry he punches a TV. Now is a good time to mention that this manga has been revised and reprinted in different editions over the years. The version I have is this one from 2011, which is the closest to the original publication. It includes the entire run, unlike some editions which are missing 2 to 3 of the later chapters, and it reverts all of the changes that were made to the actual content of the manga. Amuro punching the TV is one such example. See this comparison to a different edition. I believe that earlier eye-popping scene was another case, but I don't have a reference to compare, I'm afraid. We're now up to chapter 5, originally published in September 1979. For some context about the pacing, the anime was now roughly up to episode 22, and this chapter covers part of 12, introducing Ramboral and Hamon, before skipping to 16. Even with so much cut out, the manga is still falling behind. 12 memorably involved Amuro struggling in battle against a new kind of mobile suit, the Guth. Now, since episode 16 is outside the scope of this video, I won't dwell on that part of the chapter, but suffice it to say, the way events were combined means that Amuro's first encounter with a Guth is a rousing success in this version, so much for his crushing defeat. Also, this chapter is the manga's first appearance of the Gun Cannon. For context, when the White Base picks up the Gundam at the start of the series, that's not the only brand new mobile suit they get. There's also the Gun Tank and the Gun Cannon. In the TV series, these join the action at different points, the Gun Tank in episode 3 while they're still in space, and the Gun Cannon in episode 8 after they get to Earth. As we go along, you'll see that different adaptations vary greatly in terms of when they're used for the first time and whether they actually exist at all. Here, for example, the Gun Tank is used for the first time shortly after they get to Earth, while the Gun Cannon makes a very late debut here, not appearing until after Gama's death. Overall, I'd describe this version as rushed. It's so abbreviated that it barely has time for anything but the battle scenes. The big loss is to characterization. Technically all the main characters appear, but most of them get no real depth and many of them don't even get proper introductions. There's no exploration of Bright's struggles as the role of captain is suddenly thrust upon him. There's literally nothing so far about Sailor being Char's sister, and we certainly don't delve into Amuro's stress and exhaustion as a civilian forced to fight in a war. We do get a brief scene where Frau visits Amuro and he remarks on not getting enough sleep and the heavy responsibility of piloting the Gundam, but it doesn't lead to anything more. To be honest, after the first chapter, that's about all the relationship we get between Frau and Amuro. However, Gama and Char's relationship gets a fair amount of attention. They discuss their history just like in the anime, and Char is privately disparaging of Gama behind his back. Also, quite a few of Mirai's scenes made it in, which makes her one of the surprising winners in this version. Oddly enough, she also has a different surname here, Mirai Aland instead of Mirai Yashima. So, in terms of characterization, it's mostly a bust. But, given the time constraints, I do want to give the author credit for shortening the story in quite a thoughtful way. We don't need the ship to stop off at Luna 2 before heading to Earth. It turns out the story works perfectly fine without that. However, we do need to know why Captain Paolo is no longer in command, and that's covered very clearly. In this version, we see him die on the White Base, which is clear and definitive, and honestly much better than the movie's approach, which I'll get to later. Similarly, even though this manga spends approximately 0 time on the refugees after the first chapter, it never totally drops that ball. We're reminded several times in dialogue that the ship is full of civilians they need to drop off somewhere. It's a shame to lose a key moment like Sailor and Char's first encounter, but it's likely Okazaki just didn't know how important that would be later on. The series was still in production after all. Still, for what it is, this is honestly a pretty convincing read. I feared it would feel like a patchwork of disparate episodes that didn't hang together, but it's clear that Okazaki cared about making a version that functioned as a narrative in its own right. The art is also pretty great, with a style that feels even more charmingly dated and quaint than the anime. Is it worth reading today? Only as a curiosity, but on that level it's a fun one for sure. For now, that's about all I have to say about the first of this series' 3 manga adaptations. Let's talk about the next version to be released, the Mobile Suit Gundam novel trilogy, published between 1979 and 1981. They're by series creator Yoshiyuki Tomino and serve as an alternate version of the story, a project to write his own version free of any influence from the toy manufacturers sponsoring the show. They are very, very different to the anime, to the point that it's hard to know where to begin. Let's start by looking at how the structure of the story differs. So, in episode 5 of the anime, the White Base goes to Earth. It then spends a hefty chunk of the series there, only going back to space much later on. In the novels, this never happens. They stay in space the whole time, and nearly all of the events that took place on Earth are removed. That makes a big difference. Hearing novel trilogy, it might make you think it's an even split. One book focused on the first third of the anime series, one on the middle third, and one on the last third. But actually, it's more like half a book that roughly corresponds to the first third of the series but heavily cut down, then 2.5 books that roughly correspond to the last third of the series but heavily expanded. Since this video is only about that first third, there's a lot I'll have to say for later, but I would like to discuss that early portion of the novels, the first half of Volume 1, so you can see just how different it is. The book starts with 5 pilot cadets on board the Pegasus, Oh, the white base is called the Pegasus in this version. It's a white base class ship called the Pegasus rather than a Pegasus class ship called the white base like in the anime. Who knows why. Anyway, the 5 cadets are being prepped to fly real core fighters for the first time, while getting a verbal and physical lashing from their instructor. The cadets are Amuro, Hayato, Kai, Ryu, and some guy called Sean who promptly dies after 20 pages. That's right, they're all already in the military at the start of the series. Amuro used to live on Side 7, and we are given some backstory about Amuro and Frau's life there and his relationship with his parents, but it's all told through brief flashbacks. The premise is otherwise fairly similar. The white base, the Pegasus, is going to Side 7 to pick up the brand new mobile suits. When Zeon attacks the colony, the cadets go down into the colony and, honestly, sort of bumble around for a while, sort of witnessing the carnage going on around them. Eventually, Amuro reaches the Gundam, gets into it, and fights off the Zakus, only in this version, he's already been trained on how to use it. Also, he doesn't interact with his dad at all. In the anime, Amuro gets annoyed when he overhears him talking about how the Gundam matters more than the civilians. Then, of course, Amuro unknowingly sends him hurtling out into space. Anyway, neither of those things happen in the novel. Meanwhile, refugees from Side 7 escape onto the Pegasus, including Frau, who tells Amuro that her family is dead. In the anime, this is depicted in a much more immediate way, with Frau narrowly escaping the explosion and being inconsolable. Here it just happens off screen. While evacuating, Sailor runs into Char. The big difference here is that in the novel, Sailor and Char's early point of view scenes already give us the entire background of their upbringing and their relevance to the larger plot. The anime spends quite a while teasing this out, but the novel just puts it right in your face at the very start. Anyway, the cadets return to the ship, all except Sean, and the ship sets off towards Luna 2 with the new mobile suits. No gun tank at all in this version, but to make up for it they have 2 gun cannons, which they start deploying soon after this. There is significantly less drama on the ship itself than in the anime. The story is all business without much in the way of downtime. Unlike that first manga, the characters all get proper introductions here, but that doesn't mean we really get inside their heads. The strangest victim of this is Sailor. We're told she has training as a communications officer, but then all we see is her struggling with her new post on the Pegasus that is exactly that. Contrast to the anime, where she has no training but totally aces the job. Serving as a more positive example are Bright and Mirai. Their dynamic at this point is all about uneasiness on the bridge. Will they make the mission a success? And we get plenty of that here, including a great little moment where Bright reassures Mirai, but the narration says he's only talking to try and stave off his own fear. Bright's struggles as a new leader get some time as well. There's a nice little scene where an older officer tries to assert authority over him, and Bright distracts the guy by giving him some busy work to do. On the other hand, Bright and Amuro barely interact in this version. If nothing else, Amuro is already a trained Gundam pilot, not just some kid who came out of nowhere, so there's not much cause for them to bristle against each other. What of Captain Paolo, I hear you ask? Well, last we hear of him, he's in a coma, then he is never mentioned again. Presumably he dies off screen at some point. Anyway, Char and Amuro have their first encounter in space. Then, to reach the Luna 2 base, the Pegasus has to get past a Zeon base called California, where Gama Zabi is in charge. That's right, Gama's in space in this version. Char goes to help Gama and ends up fighting Amuro again, while Gama, much like in the anime, dies in a failed last-ditch attempt to ram the Pegasus. Now, amid all the info dumping about Char's backstory, it is made clear that, like in the anime, his desire for revenge against the Zabi family is his main motivation at this point in the story. So you might think Char somehow engineered Gama's death here in the novel too. But no, he doesn't even go and meet Gama in this version, and he only realises Gama is sacrificing himself once it's already happening. There's even a moment where he's sad about Gama's death before it occurs to him that Gama dying is actually a net positive for him. Personally, this all feels very passive and amorphous compared to the anime. Char and Gama's relationship and Char's ongoing deception are one of the most compelling aspects of these episodes. In the novel, Char spends all that time thinking about revenge, then Gama just kind of dies in the background on his own. But moving on, the Pegasus arrives at Luna 2, and unlike in the anime, the crew don't all get imprisoned for letting civilians use classified tech. Instead, our heroes meet up with General Revel, the head of the Earth Federation Space Force. After a lengthy flashback to an inspiring speech he gave earlier in the war, he tells the Pegasus crew that he thinks they might all be new types, and that he wants them to test that theory in battle. Now, I haven't mentioned this new type concept so far because it comes up really gradually in the TV series, but the novels put it front and centre with lots of mentions and discussions and theorising from quite early on. Basically, there's this idea that living in space might lead humanity to develop enhanced perception and even psychic abilities. Needless to say, the idea being brought up here, that the ship's entire crew might be new types, is not exactly the direction the anime goes. Here on the Luna 2 base, we also get brief cameos from two characters we spend more time with in the anime, Matilda and Wakane. For Wakane, we get an amusing side note that Amuro once read a review of his poetry. Who knew that Wakane was such a sensitive soul? Luna 2 is also where Frau gets off the ride. Unlike in the anime, where she's a white base mainstay, Frau's role here is pretty limited. She helped out the ship's medic a little when she first came on board, and then took care of those 3 orphans who also make a much briefer appearance than in the anime. But then at Luna 2, she tells Amuro she'll stay there in a refugee camp and get a job. She also tells Amuro she loves him, which is surprisingly direct compared to anything in the anime. By now we're halfway through the first novel. Not a whole lot has happened, but the story is already on the verge of entering the anime's endgame. I have skimmed over a ton of details, especially the lovingly depicted action scenes and the lengthy digressions into background details and technical descriptions. To be completely honest, up to this point the book occasionally feels more like a world-building exercise with a story to justify it. The upside is that the world feels very detailed and real. People talk and act in ways that feel genuine for military recruits. But it comes at the expense of character depth. Even Amuro is kind of a cipher. For all the time we spend with him, we don't get much in the way of his emotional reactions, even to Sean's guts flying through the air right in front of him. Some readers might prefer it this way, but I think it makes the story feel a little empty. Still, I don't want to be too harsh, because soon after this the novels get a lot more compelling and a lot easier to recommend. I'd say the turning point is the last scene that overlaps with this portion of the anime, Gama's funeral. Again, it's quite similar to the anime, but what I really like about the novel's version is that it digs deeper into how the Zabi siblings and their father see each other. The rivalries and backbiting among the Zabi family are one of my favourite things about this series, and the anime gives us far too little of that. Overall, it's fascinating to look at these novels, both as an alternate standalone version, and as an insight into what Tomino had in mind, separate from the realities of producing a TV show with outside forces like toy companies to worry about. I tend to believe that restrictions breed creativity, and I'd say a lot of the choices made in the anime are better choices. But you can still see so much potential for things that could have been worked into the anime, some of which were in later spin-offs. 3 final notes about the novels. 1. These novels were the first Gundam media to ever be officially translated into English back in 1990. The translator was industry luminary Frederick L. Schott, seen here in a drawing by series creator Yoshiyuki Tomino, in case you're doubting his luminary status. Anyway, that release predates all of the official terminology, so Schott of course made his own terminology choices, which is pretty fascinating. Most notably, you get Shah spelled S-H-A, but there are plenty of other oddities. More recent editions are revised to use the now standard spelling conventions, so those feel a bit more familiar. 2. These novels were revised in Japan after the original publication, with Tomino making some minor changes. There is some misinformation floating around that the differences are bigger than that, with major alterations to who lives and who dies to align better with the anime. I can tell you that is not the case. Tomino even says in his afterword that he thought about changing that and decided against it. In any case, the English version is based on the newer editions. There isn't some even newer version out there with a different ending. And 3, there are some other novels based on the original Gundam. A totally different novelization came out in 1980, written by Masaaki Nakane. All I can find online is that it's a pretty close adaptation of the anime and it's long out of print, so that's all you're getting. But also, Tomino later wrote a book called Secret Meeting Amuro and Lala. This one's more interesting, but it's better discussed in a future video, so don't forget to subscribe. Now, at last, it's time to talk about the best known reworking of the original Gundam, the movie trilogy. Starting in 1981, the TV series was re-released in the form of 3 movies, which were an edited version of the series with new animation mixed in. The first one covers the first 14 episodes in 139 minutes. For context, if we take the TV show and cut out things like openings, endings, and recaps, the total runtime is about 288 minutes, so the movie is about half the length. What's interesting is how they cut it down. So let's go through episode by episode and see what they did. The first 2 episodes are barely changed at all, which makes sense since they have all the setup. But already we can start to see the kinds of changes they made throughout. The pacing is a bit quicker, a lot of little snips here and there. There's also the odd shot with the animation replaced. The same content, just redrawn to look shiny and new. There's a lot of that throughout the movie, so I'll include comparisons where I can, but now is a good time to note that if I describe each and every change, we'll be here all day, so please be kind when I inevitably miss things. The biggest change in episode 1 is cutting the first scene with Shah. It adds a bit of exposition, but I guess they decided it wasn't strictly essential. To make up for it, Shah's second scene, now his introduction, got an extra little moment at the start where we see him tapping his foot impatiently. Episode 2 also has a few little Shah moments missing, but nothing so specific. I did notice an interesting dialogue change though. An order from Bright to increase main engine power is changed to mention Minovsky particle dispersal. The movie has a few cases like this where they added in series-specific terminology, especially replacing Federation HQ with Jaburo on several occasions. I guess by the time they made the movies they had a more confident idea of the world building. After 2 episodes that are mostly intact, episode 3 is mostly cut. We do get a scene of Frau seeing to the refugees, Bright and Sailor chatting in the elevator, Frau bringing some food and clothes to Amuro, and some brief remnants of the Shah gets resupplied plotline. Otherwise, it's all gone. For now at least. Put a pin in that one. The episode's premise is that the White Base can choose to either attack Shah while he's resupplying, or fly past him to the Luna 2 base. Bright calls a vote among the crew, who decide to attack. Among other things, I like how this episode shows Bright as not super comfortable being in charge yet. This episode is also the first use of the gun tank, which Hayato and Kai volunteer to pilot. The movie gets to this later, but it does mean we get a longer stretch without these two doing much of any importance. Episode 4 is also removed almost entirely. This is the one where the crew arrives at the Luna 2 base, then they all get arrested because they've been openly using top secret Federation technology. To be honest, I find the premise kind of forced. What else were they supposed to do? So cutting it is not exactly a net negative. In the movie, Joaquin, the commander, just says the White Base is to leave immediately to head to Jaburo, taking the refugees with them. All the animation is new, even though it's visually quite a similar scene. It's amusing how Joaquin looks so angry in the TV series and so meek and apologetic in the movie. However, this change has a big side effect, which is that we lose out on Captain Paolo's funeral. In the movie, he's just wheeled away on a gurney, never to be seen again. It's an example of the movie's quick pacing making it harder to follow. Sure, technically they show where the captain went, but it's a blink and you'll miss it moment. We also lose this great scene where Amuro explains the difference between a Gundam and a Zaku by drawing diagrams in his prison food. Small note, there's a scene inserted in the movie at this point where Kai teases Hayato and Sailor tells him to get back to work. That's actually originally from episode 6 and was moved up a bit. Not long after this is a new scene that's a similar cute character moment, with everyone changing into their normal suits and Hayato not being able to find one in his size because he's just too small. With episode 5, we're back to the main plot as the White Base goes down to Earth. In practice, despite only minor plot changes, very little of the original episode 5 is in the movie. That's for a few reasons. Firstly, they redrew almost every scene set on the bridge. Scenes of characters in general, actually, including some particularly egregious scenes of Shah looking off model. Secondly, we start to see changes here to the general vibe of the technology. The original series was heavily influenced by the toy company, who apparently didn't quite get the type of show Tomino was trying to make. That led to some oddities like this, the Gundam Hammer. Why would you ever use a flail in space? I cannot tell you. The movie cuts out the Gundam Hammer completely, which has a knock-on effect. Amuro's battle with Shah here heavily involved the Gundam Hammer, so they had to replace the whole battle with something else. Namely, their duel from the 3rd episode, which got cut out earlier. See, it came back. Later, when the Gundam enters the atmosphere, they again made the technology slightly less cartoonish. In the series, the Gundam releases a heat-proof film that protects it, but the movie has this kind of cooling system instead. Now, I'd like to take a moment to discuss a new character introduced in episode 5. One who is quite prominent over the next few episodes, but is gone almost as quickly as he arrived. I am of course talking about Lieutenant Reed. So, Lieutenant Reed is not actually important at all, but he fascinates me because his appearance and disappearance are just so sudden. To give you the background, he's on a ship that accompanies the White Base from Luna 2, and is planning to enter the atmosphere in his own capsule. When that capsule gets damaged and he comes aboard the White Base instead, he's suddenly the highest ranking officer, and he makes sure we know it. Every single thing he says and does reminds us what a self-important, thin-skinned prick he is. He belittles and countermands Bright, blaming him for everything that goes wrong, and offering no useful solutions himself. And that's actually his main contribution to the show. He adds tension on the bridge. Those arguments with Bright get a lot of screen time, but then he's hastily written out 4 episodes later and is never mentioned again, like a failed experiment the writers abandoned. He wasn't in the novels or the first manga adaptation at all, but cutting him out of the movie would probably have been impractical. Still, the big reduction in screen time he gets in the movie makes him feel like even more of a weird anomaly. Less facetiously, this episode also introduces Garma. Garma's an interesting villain, immature, too trusting, and eager to impress his sister Cassilia, who we'll meet later. I enjoy the way he twiddles with his hair. Let's move on to episodes 6, 7, 8 and 9. These had to be cut down quite a bit because in a movie format, the heroes really don't need to face Garma's forces 4 times in a row. But the way they combine them is not very straightforward, so bear with me. For ease of understanding, I'll divide it up into sections. We'll start with the setup, how the characters all end up involved in the battle. This mostly comes from episodes 6 and 9. First, we have Char and Garma. We get the scene from episode 6 of Char meeting Garma on his ship and teasing him a bit. Then we jump ahead to episode 9, where Garma is about to launch in a fighter squadron and Char tells him he doesn't have to go himself. In the TV series, Garma doesn't launch yet and they talk some more, but the movie cuts straight to a scene later in the episode where he does launch. Secondly, the White Base crew. On the bridge, they receive a less than helpful message from HQ, episode 9. Then the ship has a close shave with a mountain. This is actually from episode 8, but then it cuts back to 6 for Lieutenant Reed insisting that they fly higher even though it'll expose them to the enemy. The dialogue is changed, which honestly applies to this whole section of the movie. They had to make all of this different footage fit together. Next is a scene that's mostly new, although it resembles one from episode 6 and borrows parts of it. In the series, Amuro and friends call the bridge to propose that Amuro goes in the gun tank with Hayato. In the movie, Ryu and Kai call the bridge to explain that Ryu will go in the gun tank with Hayato, and Kai will go in the gun cannon. The gun tank finally debuts here in the movie. They combined it with the gun cannon's debut and made them both happen at the same time. This scene also adds some top-class snark from Kai that's not in the series, but we sadly lose this moment where Lieutenant Reed shouts at Kika and makes her cry. Finally, Amuro. We start off at the end of episode 6, where he gets out of the Gundam and is greeted by Frau, but he doesn't say a word to her and then brushes off the orphans too before huddling up in bed. In the TV series, this part is slightly longer. He brushes past some others too. Then we jump to episode 9, where Frau goes into Amuro's room and argues with him. Soon we get a later episode 9 scene where Frau contacts the bridge from Amuro's room to tell them Amuro's not willing to fight. Later, Bright arrives for the iconic Bright slap scene, which is pretty much identical in both versions. While arguing with Amuro, Bright slaps Amuro in the face. Twice. Amuro says even his own father never hit him, and Bright calls him spoiled, saying that you can't be a real man without taking a few lumps. This scene has taken on kind of a mythical quality among fans. According to TV tropes, it has been scientifically proven that the Bright slap transforms wimps into men of destiny. Now, I can tell you that is not what's happening in this scene. If anything, this only drives a bigger wedge between them. What actually makes Amuro get up and fight here is Bright's mention of Char as he leaves. The rivalry is strong. Next time we cut back to Amuro, we get this scene from episode 6 where he has a quick drink and Frau gives him some words of encouragement. It's nice to insert this here since it shows Amuro and Frau on good terms again. So, the big change in the movie here is how they link together all of Amuro's scenes. In the movie, they're presented as one continuous story, but in the series we're talking about 4 separate occasions. He enters the atmosphere in episode 5, then he has a whole separate battle sequence in episode 6 which ends with him going a bit crazy and slashing the ground. That's the context for him getting out of the Gundam and not wanting to talk to anyone. Then we have all of episode 7 and 8 in between. Then in episode 9 we have the scene where Frau comes to visit. Amuro then gets up and goes to eat, in a sequence that shows off some of the unease brewing on the ship, with food rations running low. And then he goes back to his room and gets visited by Frau again, leading to the Bright slap scene. Now there are merits to how the movie presents all this. The impact on Amuro's psyche is a key theme of these episodes, but in the TV series his mood goes up and down. He can end an episode going berserk and not wanting to talk to anyone, and then be fine for 2 episodes until it all kicks off again. Still, the movie suffers a bit from having this all happen right after the atmospheric entry. Sure, that was probably quite traumatizing, but the movie didn't dwell on it enough for us to feel like that could set off this response. The cause and effect feels stronger in the series. Anyway, that's the setup. Next, the action scenes. All 4 episodes worth, smushed into one. The gun tank launches first, with Ryu and Hayato inside. Some of the gun tank footage is from episode 6, but as mentioned, Ryu wasn't in the gun tank in episode 6, Amuro was, so the shots of him are new. So are plenty of other shots, honestly. Part of why this is also fiddly to explain is that they combined large parts of these episodes, but then also redrew a lot of what they kept. So if my explanation ends up being a bit approximate, you'll have to forgive me. Anyway, then the gun cannon launches, and that pretty much comes from episode 8. A lot of shots had the background switch from sunset to daylight, but all the wonderful close-ups of Kai looking terrified are straight out of episode 8. Also, the gun cannon's ungainly launch is redrawn to be even more ungainly. Honestly, I love this, I think it's really cute. When Amuro launches in the Gundam, we start off with him stumbling and getting used to Earth's gravity, episode 6. We soon segue into a version of episode 9's battle, where Amuro fights the Dops by jumping into the air. Whenever he lands, they redrew it to make the background match the other scenes. Scattered throughout all this, we see Garma in his fighter. Apart from a few bits of new animation, these shots are all from episode 9 as well. But then we veer away from that. You see, episode 9 involved Garma telling Char not to interfere, with Char taking that in a slightly interesting way by sabotaging a communication cable, purposely leaving Garma high and dry and then feigning ignorance later. None of that happens. Char just joins the battle instead. I am a little sad to lose this, both because it's very entertaining, and because it's more foreshadowing of Char's inevitable betrayal. But I guess that doesn't need so much foreshadowing when it's coming up so soon in the movie. Anyway, Char doesn't join the battle in episode 9, but he does in episode 7. That's right, almost all of this Amuro-Char battle in the movie is straight from episode 7. They did animate a new sequence in between where the White Base sends Amuro a rifle because he's using one in episode 7, but he dropped the one he was holding earlier in the episode 9 footage. Actually though, in the original episode 9 footage he was using the bazooka, not the rifle, but the movie redrew that to be the rifle, but they still had him drop the rifle, necessitating the new scene where they send him a new rifle. You see why this is so fiddly to explain? Char and Garma ultimately leave the battlefield with a scene from episode 7 where they retreat to reconsider their approach. After the battle, we get the scene from the end of episode 9 where Matilda, a Federation officer, visits the ship to give supplies and another unhelpful update from HQ, while telling Amuro that he might have psychic powers. This scene is very similar to the TV show, although they cut the slightly odd narration about how Amuro had never known the scent of a woman before. This is also when Lieutenant Reed is quietly written out. Finally, we have the episode 6 scene where Char takes a shower and Garma sits outside and chats with him. The dialogue is changed to lead into what's happening next in the movie, but the homoeroticism is all fully intact. So, that's a rough outline of what the movie used from these 4 episodes, and how. Considering it's cobbled together from 4 different episodes, you'd never guess it's remarkably coherent but with much snappier pacing. But that's enough about what they kept from these episodes. I'd like to talk a bit about what they didn't keep. Since I already covered most of 6 and 9, let's discuss the real meat here, episodes 7 and 8. The movie basically keeps just the action scenes from these while cutting all of the surrounding plot. This is especially notable because these are the 2 episodes that focus most on the refugees who have been living on the ship ever since it left Side 7. The movie dedicates so little time to them that I'd argue it weakens that theme of war's impact on ordinary people. Episode 7 is the one where a group of elderly civilians take the 3 orphans hostage to try and force the crew to let them off the ship, even though they're in Zeon territory. This whole setup feels a little forced, but it is a good lead into the next episode. This one also has a particular focus on Kai, with him constantly making wisecracks and getting on everyone's nerves. This culminates in Bright punching him across the room. Then we get to episode 8, which is, for my money, one of the best episodes in the series. This is where Bright proposes a temporary ceasefire so that they can drop off some refugees who want to live in this specific location. One woman in particular wants to take her son to a town called St. Angus, where the boy's father grew up. Of course, the ceasefire is also a ruse to get the Gundam behind enemy lines. I like this episode for a few reasons. First, the subterfuge is good fun. But secondly, it puts a very human face on some of the Zeon soldiers. 2 of them are assigned to accompany the drop-off, and we see that they're just regular guys who will wave back at a child and lend a hand to the mother and son trying to find St. Angus. It's a good reminder that the enemy are real human beings too. And finally, the episode's harrowing ending, where the mother realises that St. Angus is now a big crater in the ground. Even though you see it coming, it hits hard. She tried to cling on to some kind of normalcy, to have an ordinary life again, but war has made that impossible. Of course, I can understand why this episode's plot was cut in the movie, it's hardly essential, but I do think it's a big loss. The show has plenty of misfires, but when it's firing on all cylinders, it explores its themes in a way that really sticks with you. Okay, after all that, we're finally back to episodes being treated as whole pieces. They didn't make a lot of changes in episode 10, just the usual little cuts and redrawn animation. For some reason, there's a section where the original footage was flipped horizontally. But yes, the basic story is intact. The white base hides out in a ruined city while Garma expresses his undying love to Isolina, the daughter of the former mayor. Her father does not approve of the relationship. Anyway, when Garma goes off to battle, Shah deliberately gives him the wrong information, leading him right into the line of fire. Shah then calls and tells Garma to blame this on the misfortune of his birth. Clearly, Shah has a grudge against the Zabi family, Zeon's rulers. Garma attempts to ram the white base, but that fails too, and his ship explodes, taking him with it as he thinks of Isolina one last time. Episode 11 introduces more of the Zabi family. These are our big bads essentially, the ruling family of the Principality of Zeon. But Degwin, the Sovereign, is not actually the evil mastermind. That prize goes to his oldest son, Giren. This starts to become clear in episode 11's opening scene. In the wake of Garma's death, Degwin gets a visit from his 3 surviving children, Giren, Cassilia and Dozal. He just wants to mourn his son privately, but calculating Giren insists they hold a big state funeral to rally the people. I won't go into too much detail about the Zabis since they're more important later in the series, not to mention that, as I said earlier, this funeral stuff carries over pretty closely in most adaptations. However, the movie cuts a second scene with them here where that familial friction is made even clearer. I mentioned earlier that the anime gives us too little of this, so it's sad for the movie to cut one of these scenes. They also discuss Shah's failure to save Garma. Of course, they don't know that Shah deliberately got him killed, and Degwin tells Dozal to demote Shah, which does help set up the plot for later. Anyway, along with that scene, the rest of episode 11 is cut. The main plot is about Garma's grieving lover, Isolina, trying to get revenge for his death. She gets as far as pointing a gun straight at Amuro, but then she passes out or trips or something, and that's the end of her. It's nice that she does something more than just sit and cry, but it would be even nicer if her story actually went somewhere. Next we get episode 13. Wait, what happened to 12? You see, the movie rearranges the episodes for a more movie-like structure. They just had a big climax in episode 10, but they had more ground to cover, so it makes sense to end the movie with 12, which introduces a dangerous new threat and leaves the future uncertain, and to slot 13 in the middle for some downtime and character development. To be honest, I don't know that this entirely works. Up to this point, they did a great job of cutting and restructuring the series to feel like a movie, but since it then carries on for another 40 minutes, it starts to feel like a movie plus 2 extra episodes tacked on the end. Fortunately, 13 and 12 were both really good episodes, which goes a long way to mitigate that. 13 is about Amuro briefly reuniting with his mother while on shore leave, only for her to learn that he's no longer the peaceful boy she knew. He's a soldier capable of firing a gun at his enemies. She still loves him, of course, despite Amuro's fears. She's his mother after all, but she's very uncomfortable with what he's become. I'm glad they kept this in the movie. It's not strictly essential to the plot, but it is pretty key to the themes of the story and to Amuro's character development. The movie diverges in the action scene later in the episode. In both versions, Amuro flies off in frustration and attacks the nearby Zeon base. In the series, we have some business where Kai suggests trying out a mid-air transfer, basically sending out the upper and lower parts of the Gundam and combining them with the core fighter Amuro is piloting, all in mid-air. That's right, we're back to promoting the toy line. The battle then ends sort of arbitrarily when Bright gets angry at them for wasting ammo. In the movie, Amuro stays in his core fighter, cutting out all the transforming robot stuff. Then Matilda flies past and tells Amuro to withdraw due to the danger. That leads smoothly into the one scene they kept from episode 14. Matilda visits the ship at night, where she and Bright have a chat. Amuro climbs up to sneak a peek at her, which makes Frau jealous. There's a significant dialogue change here. Only in the movie, Matilda explains what a new type is. In the series, they first use this term a bit later on, but the movie manages to set it up much earlier. The rest of episode 14 is cut, and for good reason. It's another one where I like the way it humanises the opposing side, but it's also kind of repetitive and dull, to be honest. And at last, we circle back around to episode 12. This one introduces our new main villains, Ramboral and Hamon. I love these two, but they play a bigger role in the middle chunk of the series, so I'll hold off on discussing them too much for now. Long story short, they've arrived near the White Base, and their orders are to avenge Garma's death. A lot happens in this episode, and the movie keeps most of it. Amuro is in a bad state that soon gets even worse. He's left practically comatose and hugging his knees. In the TV show, this is set off when he sees lightning through the window and thinks back to Isolina and her quest for vengeance. In the movie, where events were rearranged and that whole plot never happened, he instead thinks back to his mother. This is a pretty clever change. We intuitively understand why the episode with his mum had such a big impact. They did cut a scene I quite like where Bright is getting stressed and he shouts at the kids before apologising and taking a break. Mirai visits to reassure him, but his break is short-lived anyway when the Zeon forces are detected. The rest of the episode is mostly intact. Forced to battle despite being in no fit state for it, Amuro faces Ramboral, who isn't in a Zaku but a new, never-before-seen Zeon mobile suit called a Guff. Amuro is totally unprepared for its heat rod attack and gets a thorough thrashing. Fortunately, Ramboral ends up retreating for now. Then, the White Base crew and others watch the speech Giren delivers at Garma's funeral. All of this is much the same as in the series, including the speech's conclusion, where Giren leads the crowd in a rallying cry of Sieg Zeon, which is German for Victory to Zeon or Hail Zeon. Now, what kind of subtle analogy could they be going for? It's so subtle! Amid that ominous repeating slogan, the story comes to a close for now. The episode ends with the White Base flying into the distance, but the movie goes a bit more epic, zooming all the way out into space for the end credits. So that's the first movie. To sum up, there are some key episodes that it mostly keeps, some less essential ones that it mostly cuts, and a bunch of episodes in the middle that got shoved together and rearranged into one big set piece. It works as a retelling of the story, but it does leave some elements by the wayside that made for really compelling TV, and some plot details aren't explained quite as well. It's also very long and starts to feel episodic by the end. I'd argue the TV series, with its slower episode-by-episode pacing, is easier to follow. On the other hand, the series has a fair amount of wheel spinning and repetition that the movie cuts down on, not to mention all the super robot stuff that's there more for toy sales than for narrative reasons. The TV series also lacks all the animation improvements the movie made. Sure, it looks dated either way, but there's dated and shoddy versus dated and polished. They did do a good job of fitting in nice moments for all the characters, albeit not as many as the series had time for. That's all as far as content, but one more notable detail is that the movie Trilogy has two completely different Japanese audio tracks. You see, for the 20th anniversary, Tomino decided to have all of the voice acting re-recorded by the original cast. In some cases, this means the same lines have been recorded 3 times by the same actors, which lets us do some fun comparisons.
2度もぶった。親父にもぶたれたことないのに。2度もぶった。親父にもぶたれたことないのに。2度もぶった。親父にもぶたれたことないのに。
And here's another one, just for fun.
ヘルメットを取ってください。そして後ろを向いてください。ヘルメットを取ってください。そして後ろを向いてください。ヘルメットを取ってください。そして後ろを向いてください。
It's not only the voice acting that's different. Sound effects were changed and some of the music cues were replaced, removed or rearranged as well. For quite a while, only the re-recorded version was available in the English-speaking world. However, things have started to go the other way. The UK Blu-ray release includes both audio tracks, and I believe the 4K remaster only includes the original audio. I checked the version on Netflix and that sounds like the original audio too. Sadly, this is also how I learned that it's leaving Netflix, but c'est la vie. Still, regardless of which audio track is included, all of the versions that are available in the English-speaking world are subtitled only. From the DVD era onwards, that's been true of every official release. But actually, an English dub was released on VHS. I mentioned earlier that the novels were the first Gundam property to be released officially in English in 1990. Well, it took until the late 90s for the anime to materialise on American shores. The movies were released on subtitled VHS first in 1998, then the English dubbed version followed a year later. Now, even though it's only ever been released on VHS, of course the internet never forgets, so I was able to watch through the dub of movie 1. I have many thoughts. First of all, the casting and acting are fairly decent. It was produced by Animes, the studio behind very popular dubs like Cowboy Bebop and Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, and features such industry luminaries as Steve Bloom and Mary Elizabeth McGlynn. A couple of characters have puzzling accents. Famously, Bright is British in this version, but I actually kind of like that. Less defensible is the sort of indeterminate accent Sailor has.
Amuro, atmospheric re-entry is underway. Return to White Base.
I've seen people online say Brazilian or Spanish, but since the voice actor is French-Canadian, it's probably that? I don't hate it in and of itself, but giving her a totally different accent to Shah, her brother, does undermine the plot a bit. Also, Hayato is consistently pronounced Hayato, which I find amusing for some reason. Still, the real problems lie in the script. First, there's a certain impreciseness when it comes to the technological side of things. Compare and contrast the subtitle translation with the dub audio here.
Have the Zeons deployed an army of Roboton invaders? Well, there went the last of my phaser neutrons.
That thing must be equipped with a phaser cannon energized by neutron charges.
And near the end, Rambaral's memorable line about how his mobile suit is not a Zaku is changed to something generic.
Take the advantage when you've got it, or end up dead.
And then Amuro replies,
Oh man, that new Zaku has more power and heavier weapons than we ever suspected.
so I guess in the dub it is a Zaku? But that's all just details compared to the wholesale characterization changes. I'm not kidding when I say that Amuro is a totally different person in the dub. Any opportunity they found to make him cool and sassy rather than troubled and anxious, they took it. Some examples. The first time he looks at the Gundam, he says,
One thing for sure, Gundam, you're big enough, but how bad are you?
proving that this dub was indeed made in the 90s. Then in his first battle with the Gundam, he makes wisecracks like,
Smile, you'll just see about that.
At one point, Amuro is trembling in Japanese, but the dub makes him sound casual and impressed.
Man, oh man, unbelievable.
Basic acknowledgements to Bright are replaced with snark.
Amuro, you haven't called in a report. What's going on?
Just a minute, Mr. Bright.
Stay 10 kilometers ahead of the stern.
I am, Bright.
This stuff continues throughout the movie, culminating in the Bright Slap scene. Among other changes, Amuro's line, "Do you really think I'm that petty?" is changed to,
Oh really? Better try again, I'm still not convinced.
in other words, they added in Amuro brazenly asking for a second slap. But worst of all is changing Amuro's line about how his father never hit him. It's replaced with confident defiance, arguably even a threat.
You may be an officer, but I won't just stand here and take this.
Because who needs vulnerability, right? Some other characters have weird moments too, but whoever wrote the script clearly had a very specific idea of how they wanted to present Amuro's character and the Amuro-Bright conflict, and it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the original script. It's not that every line is inaccurate. Often the writers are just finding clever ways to make the script feel more natural in English, but it often pushes past that into the realms of just not matching the original tone or characterization, whether intentionally or otherwise. Overall, while the completionist in me wishes they'd re-released this dub, I can understand why they haven't. After this, they started to develop a unified idea of how Gundam as a franchise would be localized. That includes unified terminology that this dub doesn't follow. For example, it's the Duchy of Zeon instead of the Principality. When they started dubbing the franchise for TV, they also made a point of trying to represent the original version as closely as possible. Case in point, the TV series dub, which first aired on Cartoon Network in 2001, is much more accurate. I won't dwell too much on the TV series dub. It does have its rough moments, but it's pretty good on the whole. It has a fun sort of 80s cartoon vibe that I think suits the show really well. And although you won't have the same performances as the original, you can at least be confident you're getting the same story, and the TV series is widely available both subtitled and dubbed. Well, that's all about the anime. Next, it's time to talk about the second manga adaptation, Mobile Suit Gundam 0079 by Kazuhisa Kondo. This ran from 1992 to 2005 and was collected into 12 volumes. Now, 1992 puts this in a very different context to everything we've looked at so far. Gundam is no longer a standalone fledgling series, it's a big franchise. There are already 2 follow-up TV series and 2 movies set after those, plus OVA series, the SD Gundam spin-off, and more in the pipeline. Looking at this manga, you can tell that by now this story is a lot more set in stone. The goal here appears to be retelling the original anime relatively faithfully in a new medium. How well does it do that? Well, I'm again sort of pushed into a corner by focusing just on the first 14 episodes. That's because this manga's pacing is absolutely wild. So, the anime has 43 episodes and the manga is 12 volumes. Let's have a look at roughly where in the story they are at the start of each volume. That's right, the first 2 volumes cover about 8 episodes each, sailing straight past the episodes we're covering in this video. Then the remaining episodes are spread across 10 volumes, or roughly 2 to 3 episodes per book. Now, I cannot tell you why they blasted through the early episodes and then slowed down the pacing so much, but the result is that my thoughts on this early part of the manga don't necessarily apply to the rest, so please keep that in mind. At this point, you might be optimistically asking, how did they squeeze so many episodes into so few pages of manga? Did they find a clever way to condense and rework the story? Honestly, not really. This isn't bad, but it's a little rushed and hard to follow in places. I won't do a full blow-by-blow summary, but I will share a few of my favourite examples. You'd be forgiven for missing Amuro and Frau's introduction. This 2-minute scene from the anime is given one whole page. The scene of Ryu and Captain Paolo is half a page, where you can't even really see their faces, and on the very next page after that, Sailor calls Frau to help with Paolo's wounds. Good luck keeping track of who any of these people are if you don't know the story already, but the most extreme example is Hayato. Hayato's chat with Frau is obviously missing from that one-page intro scene, so he's not set up as Amuro's neighbour at all. So when is he introduced? Good question. He gets a handful of background cameos, then he's finally referred to by name on page 131. I'll admit, this might be a me problem, I might have been reading a bit too quickly, but up to then, I hadn't noticed him at all. I legit thought they might have written him out, which could have been a valid choice. You could write out Hayato, but you kind of have to include him or not. This rushed halfway house where he's there but you don't know he's there is not very effective storytelling. This version takes some cues from the movie. It introduces the gun tank on Earth, alongside Hayato's late introduction, though not quite as late as the movie, and it rearranges episode 13 to before 12. However, unlike the movie, it includes episodes 3 and 4, sort of. 24 pages are spent on the entirely skippable episode 3, which feels weird when you're rushing so much, but much weirder is episode 4, which is presented as like a 5-page highlight reel with narration. This is the one where they're imprisoned on the Luna 2 base, which the movie replaced with they got to Luna 2 and then left. Literally, what is the point in this? The whole manga sort of feels like a highlight reel, but this is particularly extreme. To their credit, it's good to get Paolo's funeral in some form, unlike the movie. Oh, and the author must have really liked episode 4, since this isn't the last we hear of it. More on that later. I noted earlier how sudden Lieutenant Reed's introduction and departure are in the anime. Well, this manga goes the extra mile to make it even worse. He appears in a few brief indistinct panels before he's suddenly on the White Base Bridge, and you're wondering why Bright suddenly has a new superior officer when we just saw the captain's funeral. When he's written out in Matilda's dialogue later on, I'd be impressed if you actually remember his name and know who she's talking about. The way this version combines episodes 6 to 9 is interesting. Unlike the movie, we get a version of episode 6 on its own, and Amuro's surly arrival back on the White Base happens here instead of after the atmospheric entry scene. So far, so good. What follows that is a mixture of episodes 7 and 9, but not the parts you'd expect. Around the extensive battle sequence, they included the awkward situation with food rationing on board, as well as the refugees taking hostages to put pressure on Bright, and Shah sabotaging communications while Gamma is in combat, all things the movie cut. You know what it doesn't include? The Bright slap. Amuro is surly for a bit, sure, but then he just goes into battle. Kind of an iconic moment to miss, and also quite important in terms of the characters and their relationships, no? It leaves Amuro's motivations kind of empty for what's coming up. If I have to give credit to this adaptation for one thing, the action scenes look pretty nice. They also tend to use English sound effects, which is a really cool stylistic choice. In particular, I like this quoom. But I don't have that much else to say. It's the same story, but not as good. By the time we reach the end of episode 12, the one where Amuro has his first encounter with Ramboral, we're on page 100 of the second volume. We've rushed through a third of the anime at breakneck speed. Again, I do want to note that the pacing slows down significantly after this. Will be interesting to keep going in the next video. In case I haven't scared you off, this manga is available in English. Sort of. Viz started releasing it in 1999, but their various editions are all long out of print, and they only put out 9 volumes. So even if you want to pay through the nose to get all these old books, you'll be missing the last quarter of the series. Now, we're not quite done with this manga yet. I mentioned that there was more to say about episode 4. Well, you see, from 2022 to 2024, the author of this manga put out a spin-off or expansion of it called Mobile Suit Gundam 0079, episode Luna 2. And of course, I read that as well. The chapters were really short, so the collected version is only a single volume. It's basically a full-length adaptation of episode 4, replacing that narrated highlight reel with a full book's worth of content. And in a way that's even worse? Now in the middle of all the other story he rushed through, we have 170 pages dedicated to an episode so non-essential that the first manga skipped it altogether and the movie glossed over it in about 2 minutes. I'd like to note again that this author spent 1 page on Amuro and Frau's introduction. Now he spends a whole book on this. Like, come on. The only meaningful change is giving Captain Paolo a more active role in the story, which I admittedly quite like. From his sickbed, he insists on summoning the White Base crew to come and wheel him back to the ship, which helpfully skips over the part where they all escape from jail because the power goes out and it disables the locks. That one change though is not much for the time spent here, and with it coming out nearly 20 years after the manga ended, I have to wonder who it's for. This review on Amazon Japan stood out to me. Now that we have the origin, I don't see any point to this version, which has no originality at all. By the way, the origin is the 3rd manga adaptation, so that is foreshadowing for later in the video. Also, Hayato doesn't have a single line of dialogue in the entire book. That's all I have to say for now about the 2nd manga. Before we get to the 3rd manga, the one that's actually good, I'd like to briefly touch on... yes, video games! And I say briefly because there are so many Gundam video games, it's honestly pretty hard to tell which ones retell the original story. You narrow it down to just Universal Century games and just one set during the 1 Year War, then you find there are a side story about totally different characters, or a grand strategy game that buries the main story in a giant campaign spanning the entire world, or an arcade game with missions based on the original Gundam but without much story to speak of. With that in mind, I'm only covering 3 games today. The first is possibly the weirdest thing in this video, 1997's Gundam 0079, The War for Earth, released on PC, Mac and or PS1 depending on the territory. This is an old school FMV game where you make split-second choices to keep going and avoid getting blown to smithereens. I'll skip over the low-hanging fruit like the corny acting, cheap costumes and infuriating gameplay, and that Zeon is pronounced Jean. Instead, let's look at how they abbreviated the story to fit the game's short runtime, half an hour for a complete playthrough where nothing goes wrong. First, there's no Amuro in this game. The civilian from Side 7 who gets wrapped up in the 1 Year War is you! There's a lot of Bright talking straight to the camera at you, but he's chipper and friendly the whole time, at least as much as he can be in the circumstances. This means everything about Amuro's personal life is jettisoned from the story. We do meet a few others on the White Base, versions of Ryu, Kai, and this woman who's neither sailor nor Frau but has an excellent 90s haircut, but they're all just bit parts. Anyway, you steal the Gundam and then the White Base escapes, but most of its crew, including Captain Paolo, are said to have died off-screen. All the tension about being unable to contact HQ and having a crew of civilians is quickly papered over as Bright gets a video call from Jaburo and is told to make any field promotions he wants. He immediately makes the player an ensign, and then they're on their way. We then get a very abbreviated version of the descent into the atmosphere with Amuro and Char's first duel. As in the other versions, the White Base gets knocked off course and has to land in Zeon territory, but here it's because they were shot from Earth by a weapon called the Thor Cannon, so their next mission is to destroy that. When they land, we get the visual of them hiding in a large abandoned building as in episode 10, but this time the city is Las Vegas, which makes for a colourful change of pace. Anyway, the Gundam successfully destroys the Thor Cannon, having an encounter with a goof in the process, the type of mobile suit Rumbarral uses, so we get a little hint of that part of the story. And then Char betrays Garma and gets him killed. The writer was clearly very fond of Char and all his backstory because after revealing his betrayal, he then spends a solid minute giving Garma a full explanation of his history and motivations. The details are all very true to the original, they're just not usually presented as this big info dump. Garma dies and one more battle between the player and Char is shoehorned in. Char briefly talks about the moral ambiguity of Earth subjugating the colonies, which is pretty on brand for Gundam and otherwise hasn't been explored much in this game. At the end, Bright is told to head for Odessa for the big battle that's coming up in the next part of the anime, and Char watches a brief snippet of Garma's funeral. Then Char describes his own motivations. As he told Garma, he wants to kill the whole Zabi family, but he also wants to beat the Gundam. The end. So, needless to say, this is not a good version of Gundam. It cuts out a huge amount of what makes this story and world so memorable, and the acting is bad. It also ends here and doesn't have a sequel, making it kinda pointless. But I do think it's instructive as a look at how much of the story is really needed to tell the story. For all it misses out, it still feels pretty coherent in and of itself. Also, this game is proof that you can indeed just cut Hayato from the story if you really need to. One more fun fact is that the Japanese release on PS1 used the original Japanese voice cast from the anime to dub over the live action footage. It doesn't make the visuals any less ridiculous, but it does add a weird kind of gravitas. Char's lengthy monologue to Game is extra delicious in this version. Also, it's so weird hearing Kai's original voice coming out of this guy. Let's move on to the PS2 era, where we're on more solid ground with a couple of games that retell the story pretty closely, even naming their levels after episodes of the TV show. They're both pretty sparse with the fine details, but that's what you'd expect. These are your typical licensed games where combat missions are interspersed with story cutscenes that give you just enough context to remind you of the story you already know. I'm actually going to cover them both at the same time since they take such a similar approach. The first is Mobile Suit Gundam Journey to Jaburo, released in 2000 in Japan and 2001 in the States. This game's biggest claim to fame is that it has freshly animated versions of classic scenes from the original series. In that sense, it does a good job of feeling like a modernised version of the anime itself, but these scenes are few and far between and feel more like a bonus for fans. Everything else is skimmed over using still frames and narration. The second is Mobile Suit Gundam 1 Year War, a Japan-only release from 2005. This does not have full 2D animation for any of the cutscenes, just a lot of still frames and talking heads. However, those talking heads make for a cost-effective way to present character interactions, and the result is that 1 Year War has a lot more of those. Both games also intersperse some dialogue during battles or between missions. Incidentally, they both feature the original Japanese voice cast in their Japanese versions, and the English version of Journey to Jaburo features the English dubcast from the TV series, which is pretty nice. So, let's go through these two games and see how much of the story they kept. For starters, both games have CG intros, but 1 Year War's is much nicer looking. Though, if you're a fan of the Gundam Hammer, Journey to Jaburo has you covered. Its upgraded form, the Hyper Hammer, is right there in the opening cutscene. You can even choose it in most levels, although it's not the most useful. The remaining setup from the first episode is relatively intact in both games, though very rushed. Only Journey to Jaburo gives us Frau's family being killed, while only 1 Year War gives us both Bright and Amuro talking to Amuro's dad. Both games' first level is Amuro's battle with the Zakus on Side 7. Sailor's encounter with Char is there in both versions, but Journey to Jaburo offers very little context for it. 1 Year War has the decency to introduce Sailor by name in the narration, but she's one of the few who gets that privilege. Honestly, none of the characters get much exploration in these games. Most of them get no real introduction at all. Journey to Jaburo has no more gameplay until the White Base gets to Earth. It actually has no mechanics for space battles at all the levels are set on land. Anyway, this means they blast through the 4 space episodes as quickly as possible. After leaving Side 7, the White Base goes straight to Luna 2 where we get the movie version, where Kane just sends them on their way. Then we get a brief version of the atmospheric entry plot, again just still frames and narration. 1 Year War finds a more balanced approach. The next level is themed around episode 3, then 4 is just a brief cutscene again, but 5 is a playable space battle. This gives us a comically bland version of the Gundam's atmospheric re-entry. You just defeat the enemies and then land back on the White Base, no danger at all. However, if you deliberately wait out the timer for several minutes, you do get to see a version that looks a lot like the movie. In both versions, Lieutenant Reed is suddenly on the ship with no explanation. 1 Year War does give us a classic Reed-Bright argument during the next mission though. In between missions, 1 Year War gives us a very brief version of the scene where Char meets Gama on his ship, while Journey to Jaburo has this scene of Gama on his own. Next, we have the episodes that were smushed into one in the movie. Journey to Jaburo takes exactly that approach with just one mission here. Even the Bright Slap is cut, no time for anything that explores the character's mental states. However, after the battle, we do get Matilda's visit from episode 9. 1 Year War gives us 2 missions to cover this section, one based on episode 6 and one based on episode 9. In between them, it actually includes Amuro's reluctance to fight and Bright's attempt at percussive maintenance. The narration even makes it clear that Bright's mention of Char is what changes Amuro's mind, points to 1 Year War. The Matilda scene is here too, though very abbreviated. On to episode 10, the battle in the ruined city where Char betrays Gama. Both games make a level out of this episode, and while neither covers Gama's romance with Isolina beyond a brief cameo in 1 Year War, they both do a pretty good job with Char's betrayal. Journey to Jaburo presents it as a newly animated cutscene, while 1 Year War puts the dialogue over the gameplay. Interestingly, both games specify the city as Seattle. So, do these games make the same choice as the movie, putting episode 13 before 12? Well, no, they both just cut episode 13 entirely. Who has time for character development? Journey to Jaburo also skips 11 and 14, but 1 Year War at least gives us brief versions of the scenes the movie kept, the Zabi family reunion and Matilda's second visit. Both of them also give us some form of Giren's funeral speech, and it's fairly thorough in both games, including the various reactions to it. With episode 12, Rumbaral's introduction, they start to diverge again. Journey to Jaburo bases a level on it, while 1 Year War gives us some intro dialogue with Rumbaral and Hamon, then jumps straight to episode 16, skipping Amuro's big defeat, just like that first manga adaptation. Of course, both games continue, but we're caught up for now. Do these games work as standalone versions of the story? Well, kind of. The narration does a good job of summing up the key details, and if you don't know about any of the character drama to begin with, you might not miss it. Still, I think it suffers from not introducing the supporting cast properly. Sure, we get Sailor's encounter with Char, but who even is Sailor? Sure, we get sardonic remarks from Kai or arguments between Bright and Reed, but who are any of these people? It's all there just for fans who already know the story going in. If you're new to Gundam, the video games really shouldn't be your first port of call. But, as I mentioned before, they do a good job of recreating the series' vibe and aesthetic. To give one more example, I love that both games use music straight out of the TV show. They may be a bit lacking in story details, but they get the atmosphere right. In the end, that might just be the nature of a tie-in video game from 20 years ago. The big question is, are they actually worth playing as games? Here I think it's worth noting that Journey to Jaburo is an early PS2 title, and 1 Year War is a late PS2 title. That goes beyond the graphics. 1 Year War isn't just prettier, it feels a lot more modern, with dual analog controls and all the key actions on the shoulder buttons. In contrast, Journey to Jaburo is really hard to recommend. It is a clunky, dated game. The Seattle level is a particular lowlight. You're given various contradictory orders in quick succession, some of which involve hitting enemies in the air, which are hard to reach and hard to even see with the game's awkward camera. I cannot tell you how many times I died and still had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. Admittedly, neither of them are really my kind of game, but I still had fun with 1 Year War, whereas Journey to Jaburo feels like a you had to be there thing. To be honest, even though I don't recommend either of them as your first exposure to the story, if you know the story already, 1 Year War is fairly easy to recommend. Outside of the cutscenes, you don't even really need to know Japanese. That's it for video games, but I'm sure I missed out one or more games that are really worth talking about, so let me know in the comments. I can try and cover more next time. Now, at last, it's time to talk about the third manga adaptation, Mobile Suit Gundam: The Origin. This version was serialized from 2001 to 2011, which was a different era again. Gundam was an enormous franchise by this point. Nothing highlights this more than the fact that when they needed a place to serialize The Origin, they set up a whole new magazine for it, Gundam Ace, a magazine just for Gundam manga. And that magazine was such a big success that it's still being published to this day. But this version, by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, the character designer and animation director for the original series, isn't about the larger franchise. In a 2020 interview, Yasuhiko said, among other things, "To me, the original Mobile Suit Gundam, or First Gundam as it's called, is the only Gundam there is. It's also the only one I continue to feel I must bear responsibility for as a member of the creative team. It's purely a story about the little people who get caught up in war." And The Origin tells that story with aplomb. It's a full retelling of the original, reworked in all kinds of ways to make it more cohesive. I can't go into every detail that was changed. There are so many, I could spend hours on it and still miss some small detail of what makes this version so special. Plus, you already know the general story outline by now, and that's broadly the same. So instead, I'm going to present my favourite changes in the form of a top 10 list. Number 10. Paolo and Joaquin. Episode 4's plot is quite different here. First, the lead-in. The space battle ends abruptly when Joaquin hails the White Base. He tells them they have no right to be engaging with Zeon in this area, then takes the White Base into custody, so before they even arrive at Luna 2, it's clear they won't be getting a warm welcome. Then the White Base is impounded with the civilians still on board, including Amuro, Frau, and Sailor. This sadly means we lose the scene of Amuro drawing in his prison food, but it makes for more variety than imprisoning them all on the base. More good stuff happens here, but I'll get to that later. What I want to focus on is this lovely scene where Joaquin is alone with Captain Paolo, who, it turns out, used to be his instructor at cadet school. Paolo reminds Wakane that his one negative note about him was an occasional lack of flexibility. Then Paolo gets kind of philosophical about their role in shaping the new world inherited by the younger generation, and then he dies. It's quite a heartfelt scene and sells Wakane as a much more three-dimensional character than the stubborn bureaucrat archetype he fulfills in the TV show. It does mean we lose the last hurrah of Paolo saving the day by pulling rank on Wakane, but I think I like this better. Anyway, it goes without saying this is way better than either of Manga 2's versions of this episode. Number 9. Amuro already knows about the Gundam. When Frau goes to Amuro's house at the very beginning, he's not just tinkering with some random tech, he's reading the Gundam schematics. This means he actually knows a fair bit about the Gundam going in, and when he later jumps in to pilot it, he uses the knowledge he already has. He doesn't happen upon the instruction manual and instantly know what to do. Just to note for the record, this manga spends 7 pages on the intro scene with Amuro and Frau. Number 8. The Inciting Incident. While we're talking about the story setup, there are some other subtle but significant changes there that twist the whole inciting incident of the story. In the anime, the reason a battle erupts on the colony is because one of the Zaku pilots, who's supposed to be there just for spying purposes, decides to make a hero of himself and charge into battle. Here, when the Zaku pilots sneak in to do their recon, they actually get attacked first, by a Gundam. They destroy that Gundam, but not without taking heavy losses themselves, which makes Jean, the trigger-happy Zaku pilot from the anime, eager to take revenge. In other words, the colony erupting into battle happens as a natural consequence of events unfolding, not just because one guy was an idiot. Number 7. Exciting car chase. The action sequence in episode 13, after Amuro leaves his mother behind, feels kind of pointless in both versions of the anime. Why does Amuro need to go and attack that nearby Zeon base? He doesn't. In the origin, we instead get a thrilling car chase as he rushes to get back to the White Base along with Sailor and Kai, pursued by Zeon forces. Amuro fires a bazooka, which is fun. This brings up another unique aspect of this version. Whole chapters can go by without the Gundam in them. Since the original series was designed to sell toys, it's sort of a given that every episode must show off the Gundam in some way. In the origin, they have the freedom to put it on the bench and tell the story without it for a while. Number 6. The Refugee Episodes. The origin not only includes this part of the story, but combines it in a really sensible way that avoids redundancy. First, the refugees take hostages to get Bright's attention, episode 7, and then, as a direct consequence, the White Base proposes a ceasefire to the Zeon forces so they can drop off the refugees, episode 8. It all happens as one connected story. We get all the tragic pathos of the mother trying to take her child to her late husband's hometown only to find it's a big crater in the ground. We get the kind Zeon soldiers who help that mother, showing that humans are ultimately humans even when they're on different sides. And above all, we get the indifferent cruelty of war. In this version, it's not just the Federation side using the ceasefire to lay a trap, but the Zeon side too. Shah has his own nefarious plan. Number 5. Beefed up Isolina and Eschenbach. The origin doesn't include Isolina's revenge plot in episode 11, no adaptation does, nor does it improve her dad's parenting skills. However, it does expand both of their roles. Obviously Gama and Isolina are lovers here, and her father, Joseph Eschenbach, disapproves, as in every other version. But there are a couple of additional wrinkles. One is that Eschenbach doesn't just dislike Zeon, he's actively involved with a guerrilla force that's working against them, and he uses them to attack the Zeon forces in the city. But you see, Gama already knows about all this because he's recruited Isolina as an informant. It turns out his love affair isn't purely a boyish romance, it has political value now too. Gama plans to forcibly win Eschenbach over to his side by wiping out the guerrillas using this intel he has. Meanwhile, the White Base gets roped into helping out with the uprising. Of course, you know what happens to Gama, and as in the movie, we don't get any further exploration of Isolina after this, which is a shame. Though there is one more change. After the battle, Zeon soldiers end up killing Eschenbach for instigating a rebellion against Zeon. Number 4. Early new type foreshadowing. As mentioned earlier, Wakane impounds the White Base with the civilians still on board, including Amuro and co. During that period, while the White Base is impounded, things take an intriguing turn when Amuro has a new type moment. With blank eyes, he senses that Shah is coming. They're foreshadowing this side of the story much earlier, which can only be a good thing. They also moved Sailor's initial encounter with Shah to here rather than side 7. When Shah sneaks onto Luna 2, she senses him coming too, then goes and confronts him. Not only does this free up the early story from having so many key moments, it also ties this encounter into the whole new type thing. Number 3. Atmospheric Entry and Bright Slap. When Amuro enters the atmosphere, there's no dialogue dwelling on the exact hows and whys of the Gundam being capable of that. He appears to just use his shield and hide in the white base's wake, probably smart to avoid the technobabble. Like the movie, Amuro's reluctance to fight, leading to the Bright Slap, follows the atmospheric entry scene. However, they added some dialogue where Amuro explains just how terrified he felt, which makes his extreme reaction feel far more justified. The slap scene itself isn't really changed, but the aftermath is a little different. In the anime, the mention of Char instantly lights a fire in Amuro, but here he stays huddled in bed after that and only leaves when Frau shouts at him. This is one of the few changes in the origin that I'm not so sure about. What are your thoughts? Number 2. Character moments. So many character moments, I hardly know where to begin. Since Hayato was the big loser in the second manga, let's focus mainly on him here. I love this little moment of Hayato putting a hand up to volunteer for the gun tank and barely being seen because he's so short, and then when he makes a judo analogy right after that. It's super cute and makes Hayato stand out, pun intended. During the downtime when Amuro is meeting his mother, we see Hayato and Ryu practicing judo outside the ship, which is also just so cute. This is in the anime too, in episode 13, but the origin expands on it while all the other adaptations did away with it, even the movie cut it out. And then there's the way these character relationships manifest in battle. Unlike in judo, where Hayato has the upper hand despite his small stature, when it comes to mobile suit combat, Hayato is the nervous newbie while Ryu is the confident one. Speaking of mobile suits, the gun tank and gun cannon both get early debuts here in the equivalent of episode 3, the battle on the way to Luna 2. That makes this the earliest debut for the gun cannon. Only in this version, they aren't brand new technology like the Gundam, they're sort of the old models, and they have 3 of each. This allows for some attrition, rather than the suits all having plot armour. For example, this character called Kim is briefly introduced before dying after they get to Earth, which in turn has an impact on Ryu. Through all these little moments, we get clear yet concise glimpses into the characters' personalities and relationships. I've given a few examples, but I'm really just scratching the surface. More than the previous manga versions, and arguably more than the anime, this manga gives each of them time to shine and to stand out as unique figures, all without beating us over the head with it. Number 1. Lieutenant Reed. You saw it coming, right? Here's the thing. Lieutenant Reed is great in this version? It's like he's achieved his final form as a caricature of himself. His temper tantrums are really exaggerated. He literally cries at the idea of the Gundam being destroyed. When they're discussing how Char baited them into Zeon territory, Reed doubles over in pain, not because he got hurt during battle, which he didn't in this version, just because the stress might have given me an ulcer. This goes on and on. Most crucially of all, there's a scene where Reed tries to pull rank on Bright and Bright tells him to sit down. Captain Paolo gave me command of this ship until we reach Jaburo. Bright just gets to shut Reed down. I maintain that Lieutenant Reed is not essential to the story. You could easily cut him. But since this version has the freedom to take a leisurely pace and bask in all the details, I love that the author kept him in and had some fun with him. If he's not the new commander but just an extra character on the bridge for comic relief, it doesn't matter that he's in such a brief stretch of the story. My only disappointment is that he's still written out off screen. I'd have loved a Lieutenant Reed goodbye scene. By the way, if you're sick of hearing about Lieutenant Reed, you can rest easy. He never appears again, so I won't be able to talk about him in future videos. Goodbye forever, Lieutenant Reed. I could talk all day about what they changed, but those are the points that stood out the most to me. Honourable mention goes to the general sense of place this manga adds to the story. Most notably, the city where Char betrays Gama is definitively LA. For those keeping track, that means it's been New York, Las Vegas, Seattle, and Los Angeles, plus sort of vague wherever in the original anime where it's supposedly New York but we're not actually shown or told that. In general, the white base takes a really vague route around the Earth in the anime, but the origin confidently states exactly where they are every step of the way. It's not a huge deal, but it is nice. By the time we finish the equivalent of episode 14, we're a little over 100 pages into volume 3, and these are chunky double-sized volumes. In total, we've had roughly 960 pages of story. To compare, the second manga covered the same content in 275 pages, which is less than a third of the amount. The pacing alone is a huge improvement, and that's not even counting the numerous improvements to the story. Also, unlike the previous manga, this version is readily available in English. There was an older release from Viz that was left incomplete, but that's since been superseded by a beautiful hardcover version from Vertical that covers the entire series. The Japanese version is originally 24 volumes, but it's also been published there in a 12-volume collector's edition, and that was the basis for the super chunky English books. The only downside is that it's a little pricey to collect. In any case, I can't recommend the Origin highly enough. It keeps all the key memorable moments intact, bulks up or improves on plot points that felt thinly justified, and makes everything flow better with smooth transitions between chapters, early foreshadowing of later developments, and plentiful character moments. Oh, and the action scenes are beautiful too. In short, it's easily the best version of the story. I don't think it's particularly close. However, there are reasons this might not be your go-to if you're deciding between versions, and I'll get to that momentarily. Today, we've looked at the original Mobile Suit Gundam in its 2 anime versions, 3 manga versions, its novel adaptation, and 3 of the many video games. We've covered obscure oddities, thoughtful reworkings, and everything in between. But which one is the best? Well, purely in terms of the storytelling, I've already given the game away. It's the 3rd manga adaptation, Mobile Suit Gundam: The Origin. It lovingly retells the tale, keeping everything good about it and improving on everything bad. But there are a couple of other considerations. First of all, Gundam is a big franchise, and many other series are set in the Universal Century timeline. If you want to go from the original Gundam to those, you might come up against some inconsistencies if you start with the Origin, because the Origin is focused solely on the original series and doesn't try to fit in with anything that came after. Nothing major, but you might like the sense of security that comes from knowing you've watched the original version that the others are actually a sequel to. And let's face it, you might prefer anime over manga in general, especially since this is, at its core, an anime franchise. In a sense, the anime is also more readily available. The TV show is on Crunchyroll, and the movies, well, they were on Netflix. Hopefully they'll show up somewhere else. But if you are going for the anime, which version should you pick? Well, that's up to you. The movies present a more streamlined version of the story, cutting a lot of the repetition and some of the sillier aspects of the world and technology. On the other hand, the TV show's pacing makes it easier to follow and take in, and gives it time to spend on aspects that aren't technically essential to the story but do add a lot to the themes and world building. Plus, the movies improve on the animation a lot, though to be fair, you're probably not expecting the best animation in the world if you watch a series from 1979. Overall, it's subjective of course, but I'd personally give the nod to the TV series over the movies. Either way, depending on your preference, it really comes down to those 3, the TV series, the movies, or the Origin manga. All the other versions are just interesting novelties, but of those, the most novel are the novels, which give a fascinating insight into a parallel version of Gundam that might have been had Tomino not been dealing with so many outside influences while making the series. It's definitely not a substitute for the real story, but it's an excellent companion piece. And there you have it. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. By the way, I do plan to make a 2nd and 3rd video in this series. The 2nd will cover the whole middle part of the series, including the elusive episode 15, and how that was adapted into the 2022 movie Kukuru's Doan's Island. But it could take a while, so if you want to be certain you don't miss it, consider subscribing and hitting that bell. I also have a few other ideas for anime that would be great to explore in this format. Is there anything that's been adapted a lot that you'd like to see me cover? Weird localizations count too. Let me know in the comments. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye for now.